My name's Mark Hoare. I'm an architect. I'm here, I think, because I used to work with Patrick at the Soil Association 10 years or so ago. I've done various bits of work for the Prince of Wales, and I'm a former student of his foundation, where I did a foundation course straight after university in my early 20s, 20 odd years ago, and have done some work at Patrick's farm, actually, small bits of work at Patrick's farm. So he rang me up about this. I haven't really done any farm buildings at all. So in many ways, I'm unqualified, but it might be that as an outsider, some new ideas might be helpful. I am a practicing architect, so I'm not completely clueless. I'm fortunate to have riding alongside me Kim Wilkie and Steph Evans. Kim's a landscape architect, much further ahead in his career than I am, and very distinguished. Steph, although she looks younger than me, is also further ahead in her career. Steph at the National Trust, actually Wales-based, but now responsible for landscape and building design advice across the whole trust, across the UK. So she'll be able to bring an interesting perspective on the challenges that the National Trust face in relation to farm buildings and new farm buildings. The Prince's Harmony book, despite having known him for quite a long time, worked with him, I found it quite hard to sort of unpick the bits about architecture, and I've tried to do my best with that and sort of see what the words might point to in practice. But as much as anything, I'm throwing questions out, and our aim, all three of us, is that we sort of, we probably have 15 minutes each, of which I've already into 2 of mine, and then we throw it open, because I imagine a lot of you here are, whether you've got building projects of your own or have been through it yourselves, or are probably far more informed than us, will have things to share and say. And I think really the purpose of this is, how do we do farm buildings better? That's really what we're, interested in, rather than, and I'm certainly not going to be here to say this is how you do it better either, because I think every farm is different. This is about 2 miles down the road, and between here and Brecon. I glimpsed it from at 60 miles an hour or whatever, and stopped. And there is a sort of an image of, I suppose, a classic Welsh hillside farm. Barns interestingly painted white, which is unusual if you look across the UK as a whole. House visible between the barns. New barn, steel-clad shed to the right, actually rather discreet here in this situation. Anyway, remember that as we go on. So this is the question we've been posed: how can the design of farms and buildings be beautiful, functional, and express a sense of place? And I've got very much in my mind Richard Dunn's sort of influence, that this is about asking the questions in a creative way, not necessarily thinking we've got the answers. This is in the Orkneys. I think it's on Hoare from memory. And I remember being really kind of impressed with this building as a sort of evocation of place, and probably not terribly relevant if you're thinking of putting up a combine store, but it's a raw expression of the geology of its place. A lot of these buildings up there were grass thatched, or heather thatched in the past. I don't know whether this was, and that's come off, but it's standing there. It would take quite a lot to shift it. It's squat because of the wind. It's very much a response to the needs of the place and time. But feels at home. What's the roof made of? It's big stone slates. They're just big stone slates. This is a more contemporary agricultural building, if you can tell what it is. Not a photograph in the snow. They're silos. And this is my reminder that although this question is supposed to be about buildings, if we only talk about buildings, we've completely missed the point of this of this session and this conference, which is that we're interested in the interconnections between things, and therefore it's the building is one part of this puzzle. And of course, as an architect, you're always been asked to think about building. Kim's always been asked to think about the landscape, and you have to kind of think about them all together. And the problems that we've talked about earlier today, both in the economy and education, indeed in food, the whole food chain malarkey, is to do with the separation and not having this holistic view. So I'm going to have to keep pulling myself back, and I think we probably all are, to not get too distracted by buildings. This is the Lake District. I think it's Borrowdale from memory. A view here of showing farmyard, house, landscape. Actually, the two really three fully entwined with, of course, in this case, the animals and the people who live there. And as we look further to newer farm buildings, we'll see a bit of a separation has been happening. Very quick romp through sort of other global farm buildings, and apologies for all the omissions, but just to get a sense of the range. This is Marley, a granary, courtyard house, I think. I say courtyard house, I think courtyard behind, but actually, as you can see, forms of enclosure through the buildings, and the spaces between the buildings are a very important element of traditional farmyards for shelter and enclosure, which we neglect at our peril if we just think about the building. I'm sure Kim will cover this much better than me. No, I'm not. I won't say anything about trees. This is, so here we are, Courtyard, Cumbrian Courtyard. This is Dalmain up near Penrith. Fantastic, great 3-storey barn there. Smaller barns, really creating a place of shelter and enclosure. Wonderful cobbled yard. Of course, the buildings aren't that helpful now for current agricultural purposes, and that's, I guess, something, without straying too far off, I guess changes in planning policy do make it much more attractive to convert these buildings and put up sheds. And that's something I guess we're seeing increasingly across the UK. Another Cumbrian hillside barn here. I don't know. I mean, I'm afraid this is an internet image, and some of them are placed I don't know. So I don't know whether that pile of rubble there was another barn next to it or is something else. But there is a tradition in the north of field barns in there standing on their own, usually a bit smaller than that. But the bigger barns tend to be part of a settlement, a farmyard or settlement. This is Lincolnshire. Again, the relationship between house and barn is one that we have seen for hundreds and not thousands of years, because generally people have lived where they work. And it's a very recent change that we're now seeing farm buildings in the country, and we'll come to a few examples, that just appear on their own in isolated locations away from settlement. And I think this is something to think of. I remember being told, this was 10 years ago, that the average age of farmers was 59 or 60 or something like that. And it's quite a lonely life. And we seem to now be developing historic farmyards as little residential settlements in the country, and then putting the big barn out in the middle of the field, certainly in East Anglia where I live, and only making it lonelier. So I'm not quite sure what that says about the sustainability of farming as a livelihood. So I think in thinking about the buildings, we need to think about a place for living and working that is a farm, which has always been a farm, and otherwise no one's going to want to farm. A few examples of great historic barns. This is Great Coxwell in, I think it's Oxfordshire or Wiltshire. Is that Cotswoldy? Oxfordshire. Sorry, yeah. Oh, yeah. Fantastic barn. I haven't got an interior photo, which is an error. It's a super thing. Sweden. I don't know whether Denmark crept in there in the end, Thomas. I think it might not have made it to fine Leadit. But, yeah, sorry. But these great red painted boarded timber barns are a feature of Denmark and Sweden, and actually we see them cropping up elsewhere in the world. There we are, moved across to Kansas. That tradition obviously migrated, slightly more elevated there than in the one we just saw, and we have obviously timber buildings, timber clad, and masonry buildings, whether it's earth, stone, brick that we've all seen examples of. Those are the sort of traditional materials that have been used, and generally the width of building has historically been generated by the maximum span of timber. And of course, with the advent of steel portal frames, that's opened up a completely new possibility and shape. This is Suffolk thatched barn, again in the Scandinavian tradition, really. And we probably had barns like that since the Anglo-Saxon and Viking era, being built for at least 1500 years or thereabouts. And those barns often get extended. Actually, this is a 18th century barn. It's a bit later, you can tell from the roof pitch. But I mean, one of the features of the countryside is that farm buildings, of all our buildings, and more, I'd say that much more than houses, the purposeful buildings tend to get it's a sort of make do amend farmers' attitude to buildings, which certainly we find a lot whenever we take on rural work. As you find that you've got an old gatepost reused as a lintel, usually with a bit of barbed wire on to hang a bit of render off, instead of going and buying some EML. There's a sort of that you could be rude about it and say it's bodging, or you could admire the sort of resourcefulness and creativity, and there's probably somewhere in the middle that's about right. But here, corrugated sheet, widespread agricultural material, certainly for the last 50 years, but a bit longer, and sometimes painted, sometimes not. Actually, I rather like the painted tin buildings, and actually painting does provide an opportunity to customize your building to reflect the local geology in a really cheap and easy way, even in a new building. This is another local. This was between here and Brecon, and again, glimpse of the farmhouse from the road. Stone barn, interestingly steep pitched roof there, slated, lean-to off it. Again, another feature of the way that most traditional farms, certainly in this country, have developed, is of accretions over time. You just bolt another, you use a wall that you've got, so you extend off it, or you infill a yard, a covered yard. Dairy farming tends to often need more buildings for winter bedding and whatnot. So this is the same farm for beyond the stone barn, a couple of sort of at-cost sheds, which weather down over time. I mean, they're not pretty things, are they? But they weather down. Then this is the same farm, having come the other way. Another one here. The newest addition to the farm, steel framed, big galvanized roller shutter door, highly reflective in the landscape. Actually, it's actually got a white roof as well, which does you can see there. So this is looking back towards Brecon. Again, very dominant compared to the darker coloured roofs in landscape terms. And here we are. We're back to where we started, just outside Llandovery. The white barns, which to me sort of seem counterintuitive, because the general presumption, certainly in terms of planning nowadays, is that you want to kind of make buildings as invisible as possible in the countryside, and there's a slightly apologetic attitude towards new building, which we'll, I think, come to. Whereas I guess if you live on a misty, drizzly hillside, you kind of want to find your way back to your building, don't you? And therefore, there's a reason to make it white. This in East Anglia, we've got a lot of these going up, and I'm always surprised how people can find sacred geometry in almost everything, but I'd be surprised if there's much of it in that. The very strong horizontal emphasis will come. Well, I've got a few slides about sort of proportion, but I can't find anything to aesthetically to respond positively to in that. But I have in most of the other things we've seen, apart from probably that last newest building. But I know from a friend of mine's just bought this farm, and for him it's a great building because it's like it's good open floor space. It's dry, it's secure. It's doing everything it was asked to do. It's also painted green. Now, increasingly, again, this is East Anglia, we're seeing new farm buildings go up green, and there's this idea that somehow green is invisible in the landscape. I don't know. It might be in June, but it's certainly not in December. And there's a whole range of gross greens that seem to be appearing, from sort of slightly minty grey green to dark sort of tennis court netting green, and it to my mind it'd be much better to actually paint something like that red than and then what happens, as has happened here, is you plant your shelter belt of Lelandii around this thing to conceal it. So you see this massive block of Lelandii in the middle of the countryside, which has this building behind it, and often there's a bund formed. We'll come to a fresh bund, which is the spoil from the footings that are used to plant the trees on, so you get a bit of a head start. But the trees probably don't do terribly well in the bund. Yeah. So this is a new barn recently cropped up. This is in Suffolk. Just look at the colour of that roof. It's just a steel roof, sun on it. In terms of they've put the green around the sides, presumably to make it discreet, but then got a highly reflective roof on top. Big building, exposed steel frame. I guess that's concrete panels on the inside. I've been talking to Kim about this building that had cropped up on the way to work that I drive past every day, which I'd imagined as being green, and when I went to photograph it, I thought it's not. So this is it. So this is again an exposed steel frame, block or concrete panels internally, Yorkshire boarding, and then a corrugated sheet roof on that. Unfortunately, you can't really see in the photo, but the bund is in the process of being delivered. I think they're probably. Any house builders nearby have been told if they want to get rid of their spoil, they can come and do it here. So, and it sits in this most bizarre location. It must be a good half mile away from the nearest building on this road. I've no idea why this location was chosen. And around it, you'll see from the other side. This is the view. So the road sort of comes past here and bends round. So you sort of see it twice. You can see the bund going in, which I presume is going to be planted up. And, of course, it then becomes this sort of magnet for crap. So you've got silage. Nothing wrong with silage, but all this other stuff just sort of appears around it that's not actually in it. And, of course, I'm in my gardens like that as well. You know what it's like. You have a space and you sort of expand and deposit your stuff. But in a more conventional farmyard arrangement where you've got groupings of courtyards, you tend to find you can sort of collect stuff better. So here we are, this plan, if you can read a plan of this the sort of modern bund arrangement. So there's your bund. Would have been a moat, of course, wouldn't it? in the Middle Ages. Here are your big sheds, because you might have several. That width is determined by how big your machinery is. Or what else you're trying to store. You probably plant your roadside hedge in, but what I haven't drawn here is the big visibility splays you now need to allow because of highways, if it's a new site. And that seems to be in East Anglia where new agricultural buildings are sort of drifting at the moment and being accepted because everybody likes to support farmers. And whereas the more conventional sort of historic arrangement, and this is sort of this is not based on a real example, but I'm sure there are. So here's your farmhouse, often with the same front gate to the road, because of course from the time when the road was a relatively slow-moving, meandering thing. Group of barns to one side or t'other, probably orchard areas and sort of garden areas around the house. So the house and garden and farmyard all sort of coexist in an entity. Maybe a roadside wall just to help define the yard, and then of course things do tend over time to expand out of the back. So that's a bit of general context. Proportion, I just wanted to talk about because that is a bit of quite a big thing in the Prince's book. On the sacred geometry. I find the whole sacred geometry thing quite confusing, and I have been taught by experts in it. If you look at if you do a little bit of internet research, which I did the other day, you'll find half a dozen versions of the front elevation of the Parthenon with completely different takes on how they are geometrically designed according to different variations of phi. I think that, to my mind, it's a slightly more. Proportion is important, but it's not this rigid thing that that it sometimes comes across as. I think it's a question in music, perhaps also, of sort of dynamic balance and a tension between, in two dimensions, the horizontal and the vertical, as John Garden was talking about today. And if you think about plants, if a plant gets too leggy, it's vulnerable to wind blow or whatever. And in looking at an oak tree, there's this sort of ideal balance between spread and the breadth of the canopy and the trunk and height, and the plant sort of adjusts. And I think the principles of proportion are similar, that one's looking to achieve a sort of balance which isn't necessarily a fixed, stable thing, and that there is some fluidity in it. But I'd be interested in Kim and Steph's views on this, because we haven't, just discussed it. So this is a little. So here we are. Here's your classic temple, sketched. So I don't have to, tell you what proportion it is, and there it is stretched. And there's a point somewhere where beyond the sort of the perfect sacred geometry, things start to look uncomfortable. But I don't think it's really rigid and tight. And but I do think, and certainly in our work, we do use proportions as a sense check. We have them in mind in certain things, but we personally don't try and follow it slavishly all the way through. And I have seen designs for buildings by experts in geometry that I think are really ugly, and I don't think it's. It's like you can take a perfect carrot and you can cook it badly. I mean, it's an ingredient, and it's good to know of, but it's also not rocket science. And I think lots of the sort of, particularly the vernacular buildings that we've just been looking at, won't have much of it in at all, probably, if any. And if there is any, it's intuitive. I'm not talking about cathedrals. I'm talking about farm buildings. That's not to say that aspirationally one shouldn't necessarily be thinking of a barn in the way that one thinks of a cathedral. And I think in the case of scale, that's also, the countryside can accommodate big buildings and grand buildings, which barns have been and cathedrals are, and that's not the way we think at the moment, but we might do again. But the sort of where I think proportions, even on humble buildings, do matter, are on things like joinery and the overall scale of it. And that's supposed to be a plan of. So the 1 and the 1 is a square, and one of the proportions that you do find coming up quite regularly, particularly in joinery, is a very obvious place to see it in window pane proportions, for example, is that generally if you look at a sash window and the pane is wider than the height, wider than its height, it'll look really clunky, and you need to go a bit beyond the square for it to look reasonable. And if you saw 3 windows, you would immediately recognise that. And the comfortable median is somewhere, I would say, between 1.618, which is quite a tall pane, and that is the spiral phi proportion that everybody gets very excited about. 1.414 is the square root of square root of 2. And actually the square of that is which is 1.272, I think, or might be that one. These are numbers and proportions that you do find occur quite a lot, but I think it can be so sort of confusing and overwhelming. I'm not sure they're often that helpful. I don't know whether this is either, but here we are. There's your traditional span barn, a bit wider, so that's probably thatched. Here we are, getting a bit bigger, masonry barn, maybe queen post trusses, slate roof. Oh, we're moving into portal frame territory there. Now, proportionally, it's probably because I've just grown up in East Anglia. I'm more comfortable with the medieval proportion, but I haven't dissected the geometry of these. But the floor plates of buildings have been getting progressively wider and wider, and until, as you drive along the A14, you see distribution buildings like this, which actually 3 bays has been charitable, because I passed one that was 9 of these sort of slightly sort of blobby top things, massive great thing the other day, and they're just a bigger version of a farm building, really. I mean, it's enormous acreages. But I think in these, just returning to the sort of principle of this tension between the vertical and the horizontal, to my mind, these have you've lost it. You have lost that sort of dynamism, if you like, between the two, which is still there in the top 2. And maybe if one's thinking about geometry of farm buildings, that's something to bear in mind. This is Sissinghurst, which I've just shown to sort of pull back again to this, seeing the bigger picture than just the building, because here we've got landscape, barns, house, garden, all interwoven in this amazing tapestry, creative tapestry of this place, which is sort of an evolution of a derelict castle and farm. The garden not terribly visible in this shot. And for me, if we're trying to make farms more creative, more attractive places to live and be, then that sort of model, maybe not on the quite on the ambition of Sissinghurst, is somewhere to go. This again is Sissinghurst, little summer house, but only really to demonstrate that you can apply care and proportion about one significant thing in an otherwise fairly simple building, and actually that can be what makes the difference. That can be enough refinement. Colour and material. I could have got 50 slides on this because we've got so much variety in these aisles, but with just with paint colour, and this is lime wash it. So this is this is where I lived in my 20s, but I experimented with different lime wash colours to see what difference they made, and the bottom right, which is where I ended up. I mean, the final colour was a local clay which I got from quarry washings, and made into a lime wash that was genuinely the colour of the place. And I think there's much more scope for doing that sort of thing with our new buildings, just to anchor them in their place, even if one's going down a sort of prefab off-the-shelf farm building route for reasons of economy. Very quickly, God, I'm not being quick at all, am I? I'm going to have to hurry up. Just looking at what other architects have done in the past. This is John Soane at Wimpole Hall. I'm going to speed up. So not often architects get involved in designing farm buildings, so interesting to see what he did. I won't give you detailed commentary, but it's quite traditional. Sorry, they're coming out very dark on the screen. And then he goes a bit crazy around the corner as he moves off to the dairy. Here we go. And I think Tim and I had a brief conversation earlier about the danger of the sort of carefully designed farm buildings straying into the folly. And I think Soane probably managed it here. And it may be that there's appropriate places for that. Certainly by the time you get in here, in his dairy, it's really an extension of the house, and it's like Marie Antoinette milking her calves. Other examples. This is a recent architect designed cowshed. Got quite a lot of coverage. Unfortunately, I haven't got a photo of it on the oblique. But you can. There's a sort of portico running that way. But as you can see, the back of it is conventional farm cowshed. I don't know where this is. So I'm now moving into internet images, but just some of the sort of newer farm buildings that clearly have had architect and I guess probably fairly well-heeled client involvement. Is it not? Well, I think it. I should have put question mark. Here we are. Then wineries. Wineries are a place where big architects have seemed to have got involved because there's more money sloshing around in wine than sugar beet, probably. So here we are. There's sort of Corten steel box, one approach, but good, nice volume. This is Foster's at Chateau Margaux, who presumably do have a bit of money to spend on their new buildings. I mean, interesting. I was quite surprised to find that Foster's are doing a clay tiled roof. I mean, I don't think the proportions of that are great actually, and the aerial views of it looks terribly ungainly in relation to the other buildings. But interestingly, inside quite an interesting space, and that rather nicely sort of inspired by nature, I think, in the columns, posts, whatever, and the relationship with the trees. So this is I don't know anything about it, but Hungary obviously taking a rather more traditional sort of classicist approach to a new winery. And that's one we did, which is not a winery, but is a new. It's a conference bar, and I guess this is picking up on the idea of farms being places where other stuff happens, and the people side of it. This is an organic farm in Suffolk that have diversified really into a place to stay, and and the farming element has become pretty small. Really, it's grazed. It's a grazed valley farm with a big kitchen garden now. But they wanted a new sort of gathering place that people could either come on retreats or for conference, and this replaced a 1960s barn. I'd have preferred a bigger roof on it, but again, you're into planning. Some of the planners want it a bit shorter. This is the thing where you get hung up on proportions, and then they ask you to take a metre off the ridge height. This is the other side, so forming a sort of courtyard, but as a gathering space, not a working, and a bit of PV in there on a tin roof. I mean, we had planned to do the whole roof. I think generally, if you can get the whole roof in PV, it's better. I'd forgotten I had one. I thought Steph's going to talk about renewables. And this is the inside, not my interior taste or touch, just to add. But it was a green oak cruck frame. So it was a sort of simple oak frame, genuinely oak frame building that's then been furnished slightly too much like a gentleman's club, maybe. Final slide, you'll be glad to know. This isn't relevant particularly, but I think if thinking about new buildings or maybe even works of buildings, there is a place, and I guess it's an easy one to see as an economic indulgence for more art incorporated in buildings. This was a plaster frieze we did of Hares and Pears, so it was a bit pixelated there, actually for a London job, but with actually, I mean, laser cutting is really cheap now. Computerized cutting is really cheap. So there's no reason you couldn't have a handmade design or a bespoke design cut relatively economically into boarding or shading or trellising or some form of external cladding. I mean, I haven't done it, but that would bring a more artistic edge to an otherwise functional building, probably at not much extra cost. So that's an idea to throw out there, and I'll stop. I don't know how much. No, don't clap because we run out of time. Sorry.
Looking at it from the landscape as opposed to the buildings, it strikes me there are. I'm not going to give a number because I always never quite. But there are several points that you need to think about. The very first is actually how it's going to be used, whether it's for animals or for machinery, or what the farming is that the buildings need to provide. And that actually, before proportion and everything else, is crucial. They've got to work. They've actually, on the whole, got to be pretty cheap and affordable as well. And then you need to think about topography, especially how it sits on the land, because big buildings on sloping sites, you really have to think about, and weather, and then materials and energy as well. But I thought I'd just show you, to start with, a fantastic farm building that we just came across in the Omari Valley in Crete. I'm not sure if you can spot it immediately, but here it is. And that epitomizes really responding to the land. And the terraces, the walls, they are all part of the farm building in a way. And so these terraces actually capture the little bit of moisture that comes down and capture the soil. And then this building here is actually the shepherd's retreat for keeping an eye on the flocks. And there, you can barely see it there, but that's the other side of it, just up there, looking right down the valley so he can actually watch for predators coming up. Getting a little bit closer, and there you can begin to see how it works. So that little window looks down the valley to watch for predators, and the rocks that he's piled there are just enough to keep it cool during the hot sun, and warm enough in the evening. And there is his entrance into it, and this is actually the kennel for the dog just outside. And just two more in this sequence. This one is one slightly further down on the edge of the valley, so you can watch the flocks further down. This one's gone into ruin. But then, as you come back down into the valley, then you can see new farm buildings coming in, which then completely connect into the rocks and are protected from the prevailing wind. And for me, this really sums up what those buildings are for. It's to do with the animals, how you manage them, how you use, on a very poor farm, the rocks to keep the water, the soil, shelter, and then guiding the animals down into the courtyard down below. So that's what's formed down below. And they've just taken the cheapest materials they could afford all the time, just to create things that really work with the land and the topography. So coming back to England, close to Chatsworth, the rather wonderful system of courtyards, which is brilliant if you want to bring animals in and shelter them and work with them and corral them. And around the corner, that very fantastic use of topography, where you get another story down below and you use the building as the retaining wall and as the element that works with the slope of the land. Then, as you get closer to Chatsworth, you do get some buildings that are very beautiful and probably very expensive. That is a hay barn, which clearly had architectural aspirations. I'll come on to one more of those in a second. Extremely beautiful and very practical, but unless you're an extremely rich landowner, probably not the guiding direction. And I have a huge passion for corrugated iron. I think these Dutch barns are they're very cheap. They are a beautiful shape and incredibly practical for hay and so on. And in Wales again, with common corrugated iron, that combination of the barn right beside the building. And this model, I'd like us to remember right at the end. We'll stray into Thomas Hartung territory. And actually, when I say right at the end, it'll be a lot quicker. But before we get there, just how, when you go over to North America, how climate and the different demands on what the farming is will create shapes which are quite different from what we're familiar with in Europe. But I would say exquisitely beautiful and really practical. A roof shape like that, when you get extremes of climate and manages to shed the snow. So if you allow the practicalities of grain silos, I think these grain silos are magnificent, and if you allow the practicalities really clearly to dictate what the building is doing, you'll end up with fantastic shapes which don't necessarily relate to the Parthenon. And then another really favourite series of barns, the Shaker barns, and you can't see because of the projector, but actually these are designed particularly for drying tobacco. So within that is lots of tobacco is hanging. I make no commentary on the agriculture, but just to show what incredibly beautiful shapes can come out of the practicality of understanding the drying process, the movement of air. And then Shakers again, for bringing all of the cattle in, again in a severe winter climate, and how you can manage a huge number of cattle and hay in snow. And inside that building is this, which is a really sophisticated way of managing hay, managing cows, managing milking, when all out, and being able to bring carts straight in there, when all outside is very, very hostile. And then on a much smaller scale, but rather wonderfully in the Netherlands, this tradition of, which you see throughout the Netherlands, of a central arch where you can drive the hay in, and then two lines of cattle stalls either side, often with little doors out so that you can remove the manure from there. And as they're then delivering the milk out to the rest of the community is delivering them essential, oh, it slipped a bit, you can't quite see it, but it's essential provisions, that's the grosh being delivered back to the farm. But inside, that's actually what it looks like. And this is Peter Gattaker, the landlord of the whole place. But originally, the domestic quarters would then be immediately connected to that, without any division between the cattle and the living quarters. So when they were carving or anything went wrong, you could just walk from your kitchen straight into the hospital. That seems like bliss to me. It's the ultimate way to live. It's transferred more into something like that, which is less beautiful, but actually a very practical solution for how you can manage cows on a similar principle when you've got to bring them in for the winter.
I worked here in the Brecon Beacons National Park in development control for about 5 years, but now I've been with the Trust for 13 years. And what myself and my team do is we offer advice, design advice really, around new buildings and the adaptation of some of our most wonderful historic buildings. So I just want to give you a little bit of context really before I get on to talk about it. But when I was thinking about this talk and I was reading up a little bit about the harmony principles in the book that the Prince wrote, and thinking about the specific topic of this talk, which is about the design of farm buildings, I was thinking about, well, what do we do in our practical day-to-day life? And it brought me back really to the core purpose of what the National Trust does and why it was set up back in 1895. And it's not just about the conservation of big mansions, the places that we all visit at the weekend with our family and our children, but it is about the permanent preservation for the benefit of the nation of places of beauty as well as historic interest. And I don't think the word beauty is something that we hear often enough. And I think there's a lot of synergy between the word beauty and spirituality, actually, for me. I find beauty a very spiritual thing. And when things are beautiful, they tend to be in harmony. And that always makes me really happy. We're not just about buildings, but we're also about nature. So in recent years, the National Trust has been very much more about nature conservation than it has been in the past. So I kind of thought about the key purpose, really, the core purpose of the National Trust. And I was thinking then, well, how do we translate that into what we do every day? So I think the Trust has got something like 270,000 hectares of farmland in the country, and half of that is in national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. So we are constantly playing with that challenge, really, of how everything that we do has to work for us, for our core purpose, and it has to work for the place that it's in. And we have a whole set of core principles that we try to think about when we're approaching any kind of new development. Design and conservation principles, and I've bodged them. I've brought them together here because actually there's an incredible amount of overlap, and I've kind of adapted them a little bit. But these are the core things for me. Design in a way that respects the spirit of place. Now, Mark and Kim have shown us that today with our lovely, the barns on the Orkneys or the Outer Hebrides, or the place in Crete. You can find examples all over the world, and they're the things that give you the most joy because they are of the place. It's almost like overnight they've kind of grown out of the ground, and they are of the place. And that's kind of what we mean when we say, is the development part of the spirit of the place? Designed beautifully, really hard to pin down, the golden ratio and proportion. There are no rules. And you actually have to fiddle around and you have to design beautifully. That's really important because these are places where we live and these are places where we see, particularly National Trust places, because they are out there in the national parks in the area of outstanding natural beauty that we all visit. So they are going to be seen. So we have to think about designing beautifully. And then something I want to talk a little bit about, it's respecting the natural heritage as well as the cultural heritage. And those two things, one's not more important than the other, they're equal, really. If something's practical, I agree with you, Kim, if it serves its purpose, then it's likely it's likely to work. Function, you can't divorce function from aesthetic, really. The function gives way to the aesthetic, and somehow you know that it's working, and that's always good. But to design flexibly and adaptably as well, and adaptably is important as well. So I think it's quite important not to design just for one purpose. You have to think about what the future holds, particularly in this day and age. So we always try to build in some flexibility and some adaptability into the buildings that we're designing. Design sustainably, I think that doesn't need too much explanation. And design in a way that respects the hierarchy of the site, and I think we'll see that a little bit as we go through some of the slides. Sorry to start with text, but I do have some pictures, and I do have some Welsh pictures as well, which is always good. So what I'm trying to say here really is the Trust is an organisation that is about the whole. It's holistic. It's about beauty, design, nature, cultural heritage, and when we approach the design of new farm buildings, or any new buildings really, it's a kind of graphic equaliser. You have to dial some things up and you have to dial some things down. But what you want to do is come out with a holistic response rather than just thinking just about the building alone. And actually that's the point of what I wanted to say really is if you're designing new farm buildings, the farm building itself is not the most important thing. It really isn't the most important thing. What's important is how it relates to the site, how it sits in the topography, what colour of the materials are, all those kind of things, the spaces in between, the hedgerows, the boundaries, all those things will be what gives you a successful outcome, not just necessarily focusing on the building itself. And I've put just a few slides up here to say something a little bit about cultural heritage. The farm on the top right is Beth Lloyd, which it's not too far from a place called Hirwain in the Neath Valley, so it's only about an hour away. But it's an absolutely beautiful farmstead. It's absolutely glorious. It's got some barns off to the left-hand side. But you can see that it's kind of this business. The stones have been picked from the ground, and over the time, the walls and the buildings have been constructed. May have been thatched in the past, but now it's ubiquitous Welsh slate or whatever on most of our buildings. But it's kind of grown out of its place, if you like. The scale is much smaller than anything that we have to deal with these days. You know, the buildings for the animals was much smaller, the farming was much smaller, the scale was much smaller. And actually, in some ways, that makes it easier to make it beautiful and actually make it fit within the landscape. And then on the bottom, this is a farmstead which I took from Rightmove, and it's in Brecon somewhere. But it's kind of glorious. You can see the materials and the way that the whole set of farm buildings has been nestled into the topography there. And again, the materials are, they've kind of grown out of the earth, if you like. And this one is the farm next to me, actually, in the Swansea Valley. I live in the Swansea Valley, just up from a place called Abercrave. And Pwllcoedog, which is the farm here, I've actually cut off the farmhouse on the right-hand side and the modern buildings, because that's not why I wanted this slide. If you look at all the farm buildings in the Swansea Valley, they're all orientated, well, they're not all orientated, but a lot of them on our side of the valley, which is on the eastern side, they're all orientated east to west. So they sit across the valley, which means that you get sun all day. So if you orientate them that way, then you don't get the sun in the morning onto the yards in front of it. So the orientation of that is really important. And it has another really good reason for being built like that. This is originally the house, the one on the right-hand side, and the one on the left is the barn. And my husband and I bought a barn, which had actually been converted into some cottages about 5 years ago, and we set about turning it into a house. And what we knew from history was that there used to be a farmhouse opposite, but it had gone, it had been demolished over years, it had fallen out of use. But the reason why these are built like this is because all the prevailing wind and the rain, and believe me, there's an awful lot of wind and rain, comes howling up that valley, and it hits the back of this building here. Whereas where we live, it hits the front of our house. because the building has disappeared in front of it. And it's just that whole business of local knowledge. They all knew that that's the way to orientate those buildings in order to cut down on the weather and the damp and the rain. So, you know, it's not just about what the building looks like, it's how it's orientated, where it sits, what the sun, the climate, you know. And then I put some sort of silly pictures up, really. The bottom left-hand one is the hedge just round the corner from my house, with its nettles and its flowers in it. And these are the things that make places beautiful. These are the things, the hedgerows, the spaces, the hedge laying, the local knowledge, all that kind of thing. So, and the other thing about this is I think this is where our mindset is. So this is my idea of beautiful buildings in a beautiful landscape. We've seen ones from all over the world. We've seen Cumbria. You know, I've heard people say, ooh, isn't that lovely? And you know, that's what it's all about. It's how in our hearts, what we've grown up with, what we think is beautiful and lovely, is what our experiences are and what we've seen. And somehow, I don't know why it's like that, but we still respond that way to these places. So when we're talking about designing farm buildings beautifully, that's what I've got in my head. And some of the images that you two have shown is what I've got in my head. So now getting really, really practical. So how do we do this on a day-to-day basis when we get applications in for new farm buildings? And this is Brimmer Head up in Grasmere in what is now a World Heritage Site, as of yesterday, I believe, yes. So Lake District has been designated as a cultural heritage, World Heritage Site. And what we try and do in work really is we produce these design guides. So when people do a project, we write them up and we say where things went right and where things went wrong. And actually some of those are beginning to go external now, which is quite good. And this is really one for you to think about. So Brimmer Head it's a collection of pretty traditional farm buildings all grouped around here. There's the road at the bottom. Here's the old cattle shed, and you can see it's in the yard there. And what they want to do is build a pretty big, in terms of scale, you know, that's massive compared to the other farm buildings that they've got, and that's what they need. So how do you actually put a massive cattle shed in a World Heritage Site next to a Grade 1 listed building? How do you do it? And I'm kind of with Kim, really. I feel we can all I loved your barn, but it's not practical for everybody to do that. I loved it. It was beautiful, and we'd all love to do that. But for lots of working farmers, that's not what they can afford. So we have to try and, again, balance that bit between what's affordable, what's going to work for them to make their business work, but actually, how do you then make something really sort of, you know, off the peg, portal frame, not terribly glamorous materials? How do you actually make those disappear into the landscape? And I'm putting this example up, and we might talk about it afterwards, because I think it's reasonably successful. I don't know what you can... Oh, let me just go back. So the key things on here really is the Lake District, the views are all this way. So all those people who go to the Lake District are looking down on this farm. And then you will also get some views from the bottom. But when you see the cattle shed from the bottom, you're looking through the buildings. So it's not there stuck like your East Anglian one out on its own. You're looking through the buildings. So you can see what they've done. So that's... I don't know how well you can see that. I can't see it very well.
So it's stone gable. You built a stone gable up.
Yeah, so down at the bottom you can see what they did was they added a stone gable to what otherwise was a quite standard agricultural building with Yorkshire boarding and fibre cement roof. Now that stone gable cost 30 grand, so you know it added quite a substantial amount to the making of that. But you can see then they also tried to build some stone walls to enclose it, so that the views really, you look down, you see the traditional buildings in the background, but you also see the stone gable and the stone enclosure. You know, I'll leave that to you. We perhaps have a discussion about whether that's a successful way of doing it or not. But that's what we were thinking about. We were thinking about the views and the impact on the environment, not necessarily the design of the building. And this is another one. This is Llan up in Snowdonia. And that's a really sort of public view. You're looking up the fields towards Llan, beautiful. You know, the interconnecting stone walls, and sheep and all the rest of it. Very traditional, looking up towards the Snowdon Massif, really fantastic. And they needed some big new cattle buildings. So again, the solution was fibre cement, Yorkshire boarding. This is the solution, this is the cattle barns. Quite low down, but they work for the farmer. And in the building, where they are, well, in the picture really, they're here. So it's not just about building, it's about where you put them and what you do. And this is my nod to renewables, Mark, because I'm very sorry I didn't bring any solar panels. Both you and Kim did, so that's fine. A hydroelectric scheme that's gone up. That feels, again, kind of on Habitat land, it feels in tune, really, with the way that we manage and husband the land, really.
Just say, is there a central valley gutter all the way along? Is that top?
This one?
Yeah, is that the new build? That's the new build?
That's a new building,
Yeah.
and I think so,
Yeah.
but it's not one of mine.
No. Yeah. It's
Mine
not
is-
open down below. I mean, it is
No.
maintenance heavy.
It is. And I put this slide up really, this is from Shotwell Farm. You showed
yeah.
the one with the glorious,
Yeah.
I really like that arch, I think it's really, really clever. But the reason I put this up is one of the other big challenges that we have in the Trust, and I imagine farmers, I don't know how many of you are farmers and you do own buildings, is this issue about the small traditional farm buildings do not lend themselves anymore to big machinery and sort of more industrial scale practices. So what we're struggling with in the Trust is hundreds, thousands of rural buildings that are falling down because there's no practical use for them. And if there's no practical use for them, you don't mend the roof because you've got money, you can spend your money elsewhere. So what we're finding is we're losing traditional buildings. And if you think that they're a huge part of our cultural heritage and our landscape, that's a sad thing. And the thing I really liked about Shotwell Farm was I don't know whether the roofs were off these buildings or not. It possibly makes a difference. But I like that idea of kind of, you know, particularly the one on the right-hand side where the roof has been raised. I mean, I don't know if that allows the other end for the machinery to be brought in because they've raised the roof and the span. But I thought that was a rather interesting and novel approach to how we might actually retain some of our more traditional buildings. And this is my final slide. So what I wanted to say was it's not just about the building, and we do work with fibre cement and Yorkshire boarding and portal buildings. That's not the end of it. You know, we can still produce something that actually really works with the landscape. So think about how it sits within the landscape, how it functions, how it relates to the surrounding buildings. Think about the boundaries. Think about the floor. You know, you don't need loads of concrete necessarily. Maybe gravel, that type of finishing can do. What opportunities can we actually introduce for nature, the hedge banks, the owl boxes, the bat boxes, all the rest of it, and how gently it pulls really on the earth. That's what we're after. So the story doesn't end with, we need a new farm building, oh, we'll have this one, it costs that much, where should we put it? There's an awful lot more thinking that goes into it, and thinking that people can do without necessarily the need for you know, professional people to come in. So that's kind of where I was.